You're heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 93, covering the week of October 9th through October 13th, 2017. Glad to have you back on the program. Glad to be here. Before we get started, all the usual housekeeping stuff we got to address. If you do like this podcast, please share it around social media, and you can find us on social media. You can find us on Facebook at Abbeville Institute, on Twitter at Abbeville Institute, and at our YouTube page. You can subscribe to us there. Just search for Abbeville Institute. You can find all of our lectures that we have videotaped on there, along with episodes of this podcast. If you do like this podcast, you can also help us in our mission to explore what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition by providing a donation, a tax-deductible donation, to the Abbeville Institute. And you can do so by going to our homepage. At the top of the page, you'll find a button at the top that says Support. You click on that. It'll show you memberships for individuals or memberships for businesses, whatever type of membership you would like to have. And we can take a monthly donation or annual donation for as little as $3 a month or $25 a year if you're a student, or $5 a month or $60 a year if you're not a student. You can help support our mission to explore what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition, help keep this podcast going, the website up and running, our programs going. So we've got programs in store for the next year. Our first event will be in February. And so it will be in Charleston, South Carolina. More details on that are forthcoming, but we will have another conference in February of next year in Charleston. Also, if you go to our webpage, abbevilleinstitute.org, and you provide an email address, we will give you a free ebook, Kirkpatrick Sales Emancipation Hell, and you will get on our email list. We'll send you our Daily Dose of Dixie Monday through Friday and our weekly email over the weekend, which includes a link to this podcast along with an article of choice from the editor. And so you can go out there and get those things as well. So make sure you give us an email address. We do like to keep in touch that way. Okay, that said, let's think about, one more thing about the podcast. You can find us on iTunes with the podcast, and if you do want to rate the podcast, that would be great. The more reviews, the better on iTunes, so going out there and think about doing that as well. So let's talk about the week that was in the Abbeville Institute, August 9th through 13th, 2017. And there is a general theme in this, and that is the untrustworthiness of the Northern Yankee. Now, what do I mean by that? And I'm going to start with actually the piece that ran on Friday, and we're going to back up. So the piece on Friday was by John Devaney, who was one of Clyde Wilson's students at the University of South Carolina, who was there when I was there, a little bit before me, finishing up by about the time I got there, maybe my first year. He was about ready to wrap up and be done. But Dr. Devaney writes wonderful pieces for the website, and he's always very good at bringing the issue back to the center. And what I mean by that is the real problem, and we've talked about this on the podcast, that we have two Americas, and that was one of the themes that we talked about last week. We have two Americas, and the real issue is, can you trust the other side for an honest debate? Can you trust the other side for being faithful in what they agree to do? And I think Dr. Devaney's point is no. And this is a piece entitled "A People Without Honor." And he talks about how in the 1990s, and I remember being part of this, there was a debate, of course, about the Confederate battle flag flying over the dome of the Capitol in Columbia, South Carolina. I remember working and walking, because I worked downtown, and I remember walking to one of the big rallies they had down there, the pro and anti-flag rallies, and just kind of taking in the atmosphere and seeing what it was about. It was a really amazing time to be in Columbia. And I remember talking to people about the flag issue. And there were some people I spoke to that were very much against the flag, and some people, of course, I knew that were very much for the flag. But as Dr. Devaney says, a lot of people for a long time during the Civil Rights Movement didn't care about the flag at all. But after a decade of agitation and media coverage, the flag had to come down. And so then a great compromise was reached, whereby a monument to African Americans is going to be put on the state of South Carolina grounds, the Capitol grounds, and the battle flag would come down, and a Confederate flag be placed at the the Soldiers Monument on the Capitol grounds. And so that was what happened right at around 2000. That particular compromise was reached. And then, of course, we had 2015. 15 years later, the flag is taken down from the State House grounds entirely. And as he says, Dr. Benny says, we are Americans after all, and one of the cultural traits of Americans is our genius for compromise. But he says, not so for the left. As I write today and think back upon that time, I realize my political naivety. The left never had any intention of keeping the compromise made. It was one step in the long march of redefining American history and American culture. And so this is writing as Dr. Vanny, he says, quote, foolishly I believed this was just about the South. Chalk that up to provincialism, parochialism, or blind affection for one's region and people. But as he says, the left is playing for higher stakes. They're playing for the long game. This is something I mentioned in the podcast last week. They're playing for the long game. So he says, in other words, you folks outside the South, you are next on their list. The South remains first on the list because it is a much easier target than other American places and regions. Our people, our history, and our culture have been distorted and demonized for a very long time. And he says we're in short supply. We're never in short supply of the native-born on the make, eager to cooperate with the destroyers of his people. And, of course, as Southerners are gentlemen and gentlewomen who refuse to plunge into the gutter of lies, distractions, innuendo, and falsehoods used so effectively against us by our enemies, we keep our promises and honor our word, but we know that's not going to be the case for the other side. And so he says this is why the Abbeville Institute exists, to try to show the evil of the day, to try to show what's happening. He's 100% right about that. And he says the first thing we have to understand, though, is the left cannot be trusted. These people do not keep their word. There are people who are void of honor. So you cannot believe them when they say, this is it, we're only going to stop at Confederate statues. Once that's done, we're going to leave the Founding Fathers alone. We're going to leave crosses alone. We're going to leave Christianity alone. We're going to leave all this stuff alone because, as the AHA says, it's just foolish to think that stuff would come down. Baloney. So they can't be trusted. There are people who are without honor. And so in that way, this is the problem. And I think that if you go back into American history, this is the case. This is the Northerner that cannot be trusted. This is the Ichabod Crane that cannot be trusted. And so, we began the week with a piece by Paul Yarborough, "In Brer Fox He Lay Low," and this is talking about how Gone with the Wind is being banished. We're looking at the Song of the South, how this movie has been completely blacklisted. And he says, as Paul says, I doubt this movie will be seen on television anytime soon. I suspect anyone reading this will know the reason without me going into a PC rant. However, I think copies are available on VHS or DVD for those who want to online to beat the bushes. And he says that, the problem is, as Paul says, I believe that Uncle Remus was a character filled with wisdom and wit, with kindness, and with genuine affection for white people who loved him. He didn't look down on them because a few had once owned slaves. This was a tale. This was something that was the man in the story, the former slave, who had the most profound character in the story. You had people that used to write about, Joel Chandler Harris writing about how important it was for his stories to help alleviate the sexual animosity. And the problem is the other side are people without honor. And so he asks, what do these people want? What do these people want? Well, they want votes. They want money. They want power. And there's always going to be stirring the pot to get those things. And so they're going to pick the low-hanging fruit first. And then when that's done, they're going to pick something else to go and tack when they get their objective. This is the problem with Gramsci and, of course, the progressive agenda, which is always moving the goalpost. The goalpost never stays at the end of in the end zone. It moves. They lengthen the football field another 20 yards and say, we got to go 20 more yards. We got to go 20 more yards. We got to go another 30 yards. We keep going there. We're gonna get there. Your football field ends up being 300, 400, 500 yards instead of 100 yards. That's the progressive agenda. And so they're never going to tell you that there's ever any rest in the remaking of America. This is exactly what Barack Obama said when he took office in 2009. We got to continue remaking America. That's the whole point. He was exactly honest about it. I pointed this out at the time in 2009. I said, Obama has actually said what progressivism is. He wants to remake America. He's being honest. Now, we can debate whether Obama had very much honor at all, but he's at least being honest. This is the goal, to remake America, to destroy, essentially, Western civilization. That's what is at stake here. Because Western civilization is all the bad things in their mind, and so we're going to get rid of all of those bad things and ensure that none of those things are left around. Now, how does that factor into some other parts of history? Well, look at the book review we ran on Tuesday as a review of Karen Stokes' A Legion of Devils by Shotwell Press, and she talks about the burning of Columbia. Again, the burning of Columbia, South Carolina. Again, a situation where the North is supposed to be benevolent, and yet they're not. They cannot be trusted. These Northern soldiers cannot be trusted to respect civilian property or civilians in general. They couldn't be trusted. They're going to burn it. They're going to destroy it. And that's by design. They're going to burn everything down. Now, maybe not literally now. They're not going to burn stuff down. I mean, they're going to tear stuff down, move things. Maybe they're not going to do any of this type of destruction. But you never know. I mean, it could come to that at some point. But still, this stuff is often swept under the rug and said, these Southerners are just exaggerating about what happened here. This is why Southerners called Sherman's troops a legion of devils, because they couldn't be trusted. You think about the supreme evildoer, and one thing that he is, more than anything else, is deceptive. He's a liar. He has no honor. Destructive in that way. That is the devil. And so when you think about Ichabod Crane, the man who could not be trusted in Sleepy Hollow, New York, the quintessential Yankee, that is the issue. You can't trust what they say. You can't trust how they report things because they're going to distort it and twist it to their narrative. And this is the piece we ran on Wednesday by Michael Armstrong entitled, Why Were Confederate Monuments Built? Why were these monuments built? I mean, if you listen to the left, it's because they were built because of racism and Jim Crow and segregation and all these other things, blah, 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 that we have to get into about, it's all about white supremacy. That's why these Confederate monuments were built. And so I love this piece for a lot of reasons. I want to spend a few minutes talking about this particular piece. And it's not a very long piece, but he uses some charts from the SPLC and also from the Tuskegee Institute to hammer their own positions. So he begins by saying, quote, in the wake of the current controversy over Confederate monuments, the Southern Poverty Law Center has created a timeline that has made its way around the World Wide Web like wildfire. It purports to show that two spikes in the building of the monuments coincide with occurrences of racially charged historical eras, such as the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and the Civil Rights era. The timeline has been published on websites such as Mother Jones and Daily Kos and has been endlessly tweeted and retweeted on Twitter. The premise that it rests on, that racism and white supremacy were the driving motivation of building of Confederate monuments, has been blindly accepted with evidently little or no critical thinking. And I've seen video after video on this as well. He says, below is the SPLC's timeline as found on Mother Jones. As can be seen, it alleges that a major spike in Confederate monument building happened during an era of lynching and KKK resurgence that occurred between the years of around 1900 and 1915. And he says the implication that can be drawn from this timeline is that during our nation's most racially hostile moments, white Southerners were inspired to construct Confederate monuments to help solidify white supremacy. it's like this, and this is, of course, me not reading this now, but it's like this grand conspiracy. These people were sitting around in smoke-filled rooms and saying, you know what we need to do? Not only do we need to go out and get in the Klan, what we need to do is build some monuments. Because building these monuments is going to show everyone what we really think. And it's going to intimidate everybody. And it's going to make sure that everybody knows we're serious. And it's going to make sure that everyone knows we don't want anybody to vote. And it's going to make sure everyone knows that we believe that we are supreme forever. That's what a monument will do. That's why we're going to write on these monuments that they're dedicated to the preservation of states' rights, and why they're dedicated to the Confederate soldier who died. Because really at the behind all of that, really underlying all of that, is a supreme belief that all these things are there just to intimidate people. That's why we're building them. I mean, it's ludicrous. He continues. This provides a rationale for the current drive to remove the monuments, that they were built by racists seeking to improve white dominion or domination on society. But is this allegation true? An earlier timeline produced by the SPLC tells a different story. In this timeline, the rise in KKK membership didn't peak until 1925, a full decade after the KKK peak on the first timeline. According to the second, earlier timeline, membership in the KKK was meager at the time of the increase in the building of Confederate monuments, only around 5,000 people. Such a small amount of KKK members could hardly have been a vital factor in the increase of Confederate monuments. Why such a discrepancy between the two charts? I suspect that the data was intentionally manipulated by the SPLC on the Confederate monument timeline in order to buttress a false allegation that the main motivation for the building of the Confederate monument was racism. Another damaging piece of evidence that undermines the SPLC position is a line graph regarding the frequency of lynchings in the United States between the years of 1882 and 1968. This graph was produced by the Tuskegee Institute. And he says, as can be seen, the peak years of lynching occur well before the year 1900. This is at odds with SPLC's monument timeline, which identifies those years between 1900 and 1915. The Tuskegee graph shows a fairly precipitous decrease in lynchings during the years of increased monument building. Again, it appears that the SPLC simply created racial eras on its monuments timeline, unconnected to historical facts, in an attempt to influence the average reader into believing its assertion that racism motivated monument building. I mean, this is beautiful. This is why I think this piece is one of the best things we've ever run on the website. It just completely obliterates the SPLC position. And this thing needs to be shared far and wide. He continues, though, but if racism was not the primary motivation for the spikes in Confederate monument building, what exactly was? In my estimation, there are two main factors. First, it's fairly obvious based on the tendency of Americans to celebrate certain events at 50-year increments. For example, what is considered a couple's golden anniversary? Their 50th. How many years mark the centennial anniversary of a town, church, or business? It's 100th. Now take the year in which the first spike in Confederate monument building occurred, somewhere between 1910 and 1915, from the SPLC's current timeline. If one subtracts 50 years from these dates, one arrives at somewhere between 1860 and 1865. Well, I'll be darned. The 50th-year anniversary of the Civil War. Take 100 years away from the second spike, and one arrives at 1861, the 100th-year anniversary of the start of the Civil War. Not rocket science, folks, he says. The second factor requires some historical research, but not a whole lot. One of the more noteworthy Confederate monuments is the enormous obelisk that stands at the Jefferson Davis State Historic Site in Fairview, Kentucky. Taken as a case study, it sheds some light on the second factor of motivation for the building of such monuments. He says, in 1907, a reunion of the Orphan Brigade, one of the last surviving Confederate soldiers that achieved the rank of Lieutenant General, Simon Bolivar Buckner, proposed that a monument dedicated to the memory of the Confederate President Jefferson Davis be constructed. Begun a decade later, but halted in 1918 due to World War I, work on the project resumed in 1922. But an ongoing lack of finances was to periodically interrupt the project over the course of the next 2 years. In 1923, it was a group of women, not the Ku Klux Klan, who took the lead in raising funds to complete the project. Each month, the pages of the Confederate Veteran magazine were filled with pleas from the President of the UDC directed towards subscribers to consider making donations of any size. What motivated these women to take the lead? To send an intimidating message to African Americans in the South? Hardly. UDC President Mrs. Livingston Roche Schuyler happened to have attended the 191st celebration of George Washington's birthday and was inspired by a speech. The speaker waxed eloquent about how the towering obelisk in Washington, D.C. revealed the high esteem that Americans felt toward their first president. So too, thought Mrs. Schuyler, would a similar structure symbolize the South's devotion to the Confederacy's first president. And why did people like Mrs. Schuyler hold Davis in such high esteem? Quote, because he was willing to suffer for the same principles for which Washington stood. This idea of Davis as one who vicariously suffered for the South is repeated often in the pages of the Confederate veteran in 1923. Even the means that these women used to raise funds, selling items such as tissue paper, sweet peas, and hand-embroidered handkerchiefs, could not be less ominous. As the month passed, donations came in from individuals, various groups, and most of the UDC state chapters located throughout the United States. Ironically, by the autumn of 1923, 9 out of the 10 highest average amounts donated per UDC chapter came from the states that were part of the Union during the Civil War. 6 of the lowest 10 were from states that formed the Confederacy, with Virginia being the lowest. On June 7, 1924, the dedication of Jefferson Davis State Historic Park took place. And he says, you have read this correctly. The construction of the Davis obelisk was carried out as a national effort spearheaded by women motivated by labor of love, not by the efforts of well-financed Southern lynch mobs eager to put the brakes on the advancement of African Americans in the postbellum South. A cursory study of other memorials reveals similar accounts, bogus timelines notwithstanding. This is a wonderful piece. It's saying the same things that we've been saying on this podcast and in articles over and over again. But again, you cannot trust the Yankee narrative of American history. You cannot trust it. There are people without honor. They will lie and do everything in their power to show that our side is wrong, that we're deceitful, that we're the ones who believe in lies. But here, as this particular piece points out, and Michael Armstrong points out, it's such a wonderful, wonderful piece. And actually, Michael Armstrong lives in New York. He's a Northerner. He says he's a lifelong Northerner, but he understands the plight of the South and how this particular campaign to ruin the South is part of something else. It's because these people don't have any honor. Now, that said, what's amazing about this people without honor is that they're willing to fall back on the principles of federalism, decentralization, secession, these type of things, when it meets their needs. And the last piece of the week that I want to talk about is Kirk Sale's Cities and States, or I should say States and Cities Saying No to the Feds. And this was actually published earlier on in a Charleston newspaper. It was an op-ed, or a letter to the editor. But he talks about how when Trump said he's going to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement, how many states and cities started saying, no, we're going to enforce the climate agreement ourselves. And so, as he says, this is nullification. He says some even call this treason. He says some liberal governors wanted to create a U.S. climate alliance that vowed to continue on with the treaty's provisions and has so far got the backing of 13 states, plus Puerto Rico. It was followed by a different set of states that declared they would meet or surpass the treaty's climate goals by 2030. That's 23 states of the Union, almost half, with more than half of the U.S. population and more than half of the U.S. GDP. You think that maybe the press and incessant cable news shows might have made a big deal of that, something more than a passing headline. So then you've got mayors, a mayor's national climate agenda, saying they're going to follow along with these things. Some 279 cities are going to get involved in this. So here Kirk Sale is saying, look, we've got nullification going on and nobody's paying attention to this. Now, my point is in this, these are liberals agreeing with federalism, but when the other side says they're going to do it, well, you can't do that. These are a people without honor and you cannot trust them. You cannot trust them. Now, if the commitment to federalism was real and that they really believed in federalism, then they would also believe in the right of the states and the cities to say, you know what? We're not going to enforce federal bathroom laws. We're not going to enforce federal abortion laws. We're not going to enforce, whatever the case may be on the right. We're not going to enforce those things either. They would be as committed to it at that point as they are with this U.S. climate agreement, this Paris climate agreement. You can't trust the compromise here. You can't trust them. They're going to agree with it. They're going to do it when it suits their needs, and then when it doesn't, they'll come up with some reason why they can't. So, again, this is John Devaney's point with the flag in Columbia, South Carolina. And I go back again to the quintessential Yankee. Clyde Wilson has written a couple of good essays on the website, and of course he's got his book by the same title, The Yankee Problem in American History. You can go out to Amazon and buy that. But this really is the Yankee problem. Going back to the original Union, Southerners were in good faith supporting the Union. In fact, this is the idea of nationalism in America. Southern nationalism was different from Northern nationalism in that Northern nationalism was really just sectionalism described as nationalism. That's all it really is. It's whatever benefits them the most. When it benefits them, they'll be nationalists. When it doesn't benefit them, they'll be sectionalists. So when you look at Northern opposition, for example, to the War of 1812, this was Northern sectionalism. This was not nationalism. This was sectionalism. They thought the war was going to hurt them, hurt their economy, hurt what they were. This is why you had talk of Northern secession in 1803, why you had talk of Northern secession in 1801, why you had talk of Northern secession in 1796, in 1794. This is why there was talk of it. Why? Because they didn't think the Union was benefiting their section, whereas Southerners were more than willing, for much of American history in the early years, to lay down their own interests in the spirit of the Union. What do I mean by that? Well, think about after the War of 1812, John C. Calhoun stands up and proposes a tariff to help Northern manufacturers that were hurt by the war. He said, look, we'll throw you a bone here. We understand your section suffered. Their idea of nationalism was different. It was a true national identity that they were looking for, where section wouldn't matter. In fact, John Taylor of Caroline was very open about that. He thought that sectionalism was dangerous, and that there should be some check on that in the general government because he could see what the North was doing in the name of the sections. You see, it was the sections that were driving this. The North in particular. Southerners were really committed to a true national identity. People like Henry Clay and James Madison. James Madison's second term in office is basically the American system. And he was committed to it because he thought it was in the best interest of the nation. But what he didn't see, I think ultimately, and even Henry Clay, I think, was much more of a committed nationalist in terms of an altruistic nationalism than a sectional nationalism. What he didn't see is that the North was going to run with this, take it as their own, and ultimately destroy the Union over it. Nationalism has always been the fly in the ointment. It's not been the states that have been the fly in the ointment. It's been this idea of nationalism and being able to use the levers of power to manipulate power and get what you want. That has been the great challenge in American history. That has been the real problem with nationalism. These are people that cannot be trusted when they start talking about, we believe in nullification, we believe in secession, we believe in these things. What is good for me, though, is not good for you. So the left's commitment to these things, I think, is fleeting because if they can get power again, they're not going to support it. And you could say the same thing about the modern right today. Their commitment to these things is also fleeting because once they get power, they're not going to support it. They won't support, look, secession talk and nullification was all the rage back when Barack Obama was president on the right. You hear very little of it now on the right. You should. There should still be a discussion about, hey, does the federal government have too much power? Does Donald Trump have too much power? Does the general government, is it doing things that are constitutional or not? If it's not, we still need to be railing against these things because that's what real federalism is all about. It doesn't matter who's in power, R or D. It's about power. So where do you have more control of your government? Again, people cannot be trusted, particularly on the left, but more importantly, you can't trust people that have no honor, that are simply willing to compromise all the time, but not uphold their end of the deal. And this is what you got in early American history, when people were not willing to uphold their end of the deal, which was the Constitution, which is a series of compromises. They weren't willing to uphold the deal. The deal was the general government would have general powers, very limited in scope, and the states would handle all else. That was the deal. This is why Daniel Webster, after the Compromise of 1850 was passed, went into the North and started rounding up fugitive slaves. He said, look, this is a deal we cut. And Northerners were not happy about that. And so he was lambasted for this. But this is at least Webster saying, this is the deal we cut. We cut the deal with the Constitution. We got to uphold, we got to abide by the Constitution. That's the compromise. To be in the Union requires compromise. But when you have no honor, compromises mean nothing. So Dr. Devaney's point is that you can't trust these people anymore, so you shouldn't compromise with them. Just say, no, enough. We're not going to compromise. We're not going to say, all right, well, maybe we'll take the statue, we'll move it somewhere else. No, you won't do that. The statue has to stay. Where it is, that's the only compromise. You have to just live with it. That is what Southerners need to be saying. That's what Americans need to be saying in this current to America climate. Instead of saying, all right, we can see your position. We're well-meaning people. We're nice people. I remember my grandparents saying one of the great problems that they saw, and they were involved in colleges back in the 1960s. My grandfather worked in colleges. He said one of the great problems is that the right tended to be too nice. They were too nice to people. They were just, oh, okay, we'll let these people in. We'll give them a shot, whatever. And then the left was never nice. They never had any honor. They never intended to uphold the compromises or anything else that was there. And so that created a very dangerous climate. And eventually we've gotten what we've got because we've been too nice. So Devaney's point is you can't trust these people that have no honor. You've never been able to trust these people, as we can see. It's all about power. They're always going to keep moving the goalpost. When they get one thing, they're going to go after another. And at some point, you just have to say no and call them what they are, stupid. If we can do that, we'll go a long way to helping correct some of these imbalances in the American polity. Until next time, good day.